Sweet. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. My name is Sam, and I will be moderating this discussion. Y'all will be able to see me while the folks online will not. So before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to begin thanking Alana Reeves, who's not here, for her time and support in making this happen. Alana is the events manager at Sonny's Pizza and oversees, renting the space, making things happen, and there are a lot of other great events that you can catch here. So she's the person who makes a lot of them happen. So we appreciate that. And if you haven't gotten something to eat and drink yet, the kitchen at Sonny's closes at 9, and the little bar space, No Kisses, back there, you might have walked through coming in. That space closes at 11. We also have an open restroom and water station right downstairs on the first floor. And I used to work here as a barista, so if you enjoy the service, please show your appreciation to my former coworkers. So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. So all the way to my right, Daniel Tutt is a Marxist scholar and philosopher. His work examines contemporary Marxism, especially the work of Lukács and Badiou, and he works on psychoanalytic thought in the tradition of Freudian Marxism. Tutt teaches philosophy at a lecturer at various universities, including George Washington University, which I think we have some folks from there out here tonight, the Washington, D.C. Jail, and Marymount University. And Tutt's first book was published with the Palgrave Lacan series in 2021 and is entitled Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family, looking at the proletarianization of the family and changing authority dynamics in contemporary capitalism. His second book, which we had an event here a couple months ago that I see some folks here from, is a reappraisal of Nietzsche from the lens of a long-neglected Marxist critique called How to Read Like a Parasite, Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche, published with Repeater Books in early 2024. And directly next to me, our headliner tonight with very nice earrings too. Dr. Vanessa Wills is a political philosopher, ethicist, educator, and activist based in Washington, D.C., where she is associate professor of philosophy at the George Washington University. Dr. Wills is a founding editor at Spectre Journal, a biannual journal of Marxist theory, strategy, and analysis. And her 2024 monograph, Marxist Ethical Vision, which we are here to discuss tonight, is available now from Oxford University Press. And I'm very new to theory and philosophy. I've only been studying it as a hobby for a couple of years. I knew Daniel through his podcast before meeting him in DC, and I've learned a tremendous amount through his work. And since he introduced me to Vanessa's books and talks, I really enjoyed engaging with your work. This book, now I'm sure I'm not the only person to let you down right now because you're going through some finals, so I'm just quite finished your book yet, but I really enjoyed it. It kind of felt like coming home to some of, like a lot of the things that I felt like I was learning when I was reading Marx for the first time. So I really appreciated it and I learned a lot from it. And before we start talking about the book itself, I'd like to start with a theme that you mentioned in the preface. You discuss how the invasion of Iraq in 2003 caused you to experience what you called a crisis of liberal faith. And I'm quoting here. I believed the liberal capitalist institutions that ruled the world were more or less well-equipped and qualified to do so. I did not think them perfect, far from it. But neither did I expect that far from navigating humanity out of crisis, they would needlessly plunge us into one. And I know Daniel also was involved with the anti-war movement at the time. So I was wondering if you could both begin by discussing what that crisis of liberal faith looked like for you, what your experiences in the anti-war movement taught you, and how that led you to find Marx.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that introduction and for your question. And I mean, for me, it was a mixture of a few things happening all at once, and then me trying to make sense of that. So one thing that was happening was I was in graduate school. I was pursuing a PhD in philosophy, and I was there because in my education up to that point, as an undergraduate philosophy major, philosophy seemed like the thing that was most fun, most challenging, and also most likely to give me real answers to help me to make sense of the world, of my experience, right, of reality. And so I think at that point it was just my first year or second in grad school. And although I learned quite a lot in grad school and a lot that eventually would help me write this book, at the time I felt sort of frustrated and disconnected. I was seeing this horror unfold out in the world, right? But we never talked about it in any of my seminars, and that just began to seem stranger and stranger. And then also just the fact that I had gone to Princeton for my undergrad degree, and I had mostly enjoyed my time there, but had left, very much like with a liberal worldview, as one does, like after 4 years of that kind of education. And I was seeing just how completely unequal to the task that was, again, to the task of trying to make sense of this kind of apparent contradiction and absurdity of the invasion of Iraq and the already ongoing invasion of Afghanistan. And so I was responding to that by protesting, by getting involved in the anti-war movement, and I got to know different people, right? And I was suddenly, one of the things that is important about movement work and about organizing is just the literal proximity to other people who are similarly motivated and similarly inclined and are seeing the world in a way that is similar, right, to you. And that then it opened up new conversations where now I'm talking with committed anarchists, and I'm talking with committed Marxists and anarchists and Marxists of all sorts of different flavors. I'm like gesticulating with the mic, which is not good for. So that just it really opened up a different kind of education then. And I started reading Marx. I went from somebody who my history classes felt like, oh, you want me to memorize these dates and names, to, oh, wait, history is fascinating because it turns out it's full of the masses organizing, responding to their oppression and exploitation in all kinds of interesting ways that we can learn from, right? And these questions about why is this happening can be answered by understanding history and understanding like how it is that these circumstances emerged to begin with. And so that really just set me on a different path that I'm still on. Yeah.
It's amazing. Well, first of all, it's really honored to be here. It's nice to do a live event with the Emancipations podcast, and your book that we're talking about tonight is absolutely stunning for an academic book. I must say it's extremely accessible. So don't be intimidated with Oxford University Press or anything like that. Yeah, I mean, I think like most of us, right? The Iraq war and the post 9/11 situation, the war on terror, had this overwhelming effect on anyone that has a political conscience. And Marx didn't initially hit me because of the war. I think it was actually, as Marx does, facing continual political defeats and facing the incoherence of progressive liberalism that drew me to Marx. I think that there was obviously a lot of idealism in my 20s when these events were happening, which were, I mean, the injustice of it was stark precisely because the institutions that we lived in ignored them. And there was these ideology, right? These blinders, this kind of fetishism that started to emerge amongst people that I looked up to, people that I respected, who sort of accepted narratives. And so I became very interested in Noam Chomsky and Edward Said and propaganda and power. And then I turned to Foucault and I turned to French theory. And my story, I think, is a narrative of trying things on over and over and over. until hitting Marxism and Marx and the teaching of Marx, where I found something that was extraordinarily comprehensive. So comprehensive that I could make an account of the war through the theory of imperialism. I could make an account of my own precarious labor position through Marx. I could make an account of philosophy and the question of humanism through Marx. And so that Marxism became the locus of my intellectual curiosities. And as I always joke with comrades, Marx puts liberals to work. That's what he does. He puts all of us to work. And those years where Marx sacrificed and Engels sacrificed for him to write Capital gave us a coda, gave us a logic by which we can understand modern society. He was commissioned by the working class to develop a weapon for the overthrow and the transcendence of the capitalist world system. And I don't think that we find a more robust account of how to do that. And the only thing I'll add is that Marxism, I was trained by my mentors to see Marxism as old-fashioned and as problematic. And one of the things I absolutely adore about Vanessa's book is that this is not a post-Marxist appraisal of Marx. If anything, this is trying to go back into what we used to call the revisionist orthodoxy controversy, and to dignify Marxism for the 21st century in an orthodox way without sacrificing. And I think a lot of this, Vanessa, is generational, frankly. What do I mean by that? It was not only the war in Iraq, Sam, it was also 2008. And I would say 2008 and the combination of that war made Marxism so pertinent, so relevant. And the defeat of and the incoherence of progressive liberalism to keep up with what we call polycrisis. I don't like that concept, but the multiplicity of crises. I don't think that you'll find something as clear, as compelling, and something that has a tradition like Marxism does, has a tradition. We have a tradition that unfortunately we have kind of lost touch with. And that's another thing I really like about Vanessa's work, is I feel that what's going on here is an effort to rekindle something like our tradition, right? So what does that look like, right? And I know we need to talk about freedom, because that's always at the heart of all of this. But I mean, I don't know that mainstream liberalism was really interested in freedom. I think that's another thing, is maybe we had these slogans of thinking about politics on the left, or what it means to be on the left, where imperialism and war was terrible, but it was also nothing about us. And Marxism makes the struggle about us, about workers, about the working class, right? And I don't think liberalism is capable of really doing that. Liberalism is obsessed with the other, right? Marxism has something to say about otherness, but I think it's very different than what we get from a lot of leftist discourse.
Thank you both. So one thing that is coming up through both of your accountings, both of your experiences, is when you encountered Marxism as something from a very long time ago that still had this relevance, that spoke in a very immediate way to the events that you were experiencing, that the politics of the time really couldn't. You mentioned the different flavors of Marxists and anarchists, and Daniel talked a little bit more about the different traditions. And I think, Vanessa, what's I think really, really great about your book is I think you do a great job of cutting through a little bit of that and engaging it, but really reaching through it and getting to, I think, what the core of Marxism is. And I think sometimes, especially like from my experience, you know, a generation or so removed from yours, coming to Marxism and hearing a lot of different accounts, a lot of different stories of it. And at one point I realized, wow, every professor I have, every person I've met, everyone who's said anything about Marxism to me, they've all been saying something completely different. So I may as well just sit down and try to read the guy myself. So that's kind of how I came to it. And in order so we can get to some of these controversies and some of those some of those different interpretations. Maybe let's start with the basics. So I guess it's up to you both, but I think one thing we could do, because a lot of the time people talk about Marxism with, different definitions and different concepts. Most people are familiar with class struggle, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat. I'm wondering, what would we think about starting with how to read Marx? Because so much of your work and your book is, really, I think, to use a word that gets thrown around a lot, dialectical. And I think that's really what's unique about the way you not only center Marx, but also Marx as like an ethical thinker, that it's unique from other ethical philosophies because there's this dialectical component that means it's, differs substantially from either Christian ethics or Kantian morality or utilitarianism. Where do you think is a good place to start if you want to kind of cut through some of this history and kind of get to like what the core of Marxism is? Where do we start there?
Gosh. It's a great question. And I mean, I talk about this in the book. I say both in the introduction and then again in the conclusion that there have been all sorts of attempts to reappraise Marx, revisit Marx, reinterpret Marx, remix Marx, right? Rethink Marx. And many of those are quite salutary in all sorts of ways, right? They might sort of bring our attention to aspects of Marx that have gone unnoticed or place him in new and different contexts. But they all share an assumption, and the assumption is that we ever thought Marx in the first place. And my own academic training is in analytic philosophy, and I knew for a fact that, at least in my field, not many people had read Marx, like just literally, like had not, and let alone to now kind of like revisit Marx, right? And to revisit him on the basis of preconceptions about his views. Class, I think, is one very important instance of this, where we see Marx brought into contemporary conversations about class, but little notice that Marx is talking about something totally different than what bourgeois economists are talking about when they talk about class, or what the Pew Research Center. I mean, God bless them. They do, I often am like, how many people think what, but, the thing they mean by class, which is usually it's one of two things or some combination. It's just the amount of money you have, right? So it might be just income and or wealth, right? So just like a brute kind of numerical statistic, or even more bizarre, in a lot of political coverage and political discussion in the US, it is whether you have a university degree or not, which is like what, now, both of those things might be interesting in all sorts of ways, but oftentimes when people talk about class and then they talk about Marx in that context, they kind of impose onto Marx that what he means by class is one of those things or some combination thereof. But it's not, of course, right? When Marx talks about class, he's talking about the objective relation of an individual person to the relations of production in that society. Do you, and in capitalism, the question is, do you own the means of production? And is that, are you able to satisfy your needs in virtue of your ownership of these socially necessary resources? Or do you sell your labor power for a wage? And that's how you are able to meet your subsistence needs. I just give that as an example of, I think like the question of like how to read Marx, it's so important and it's such a central question, but like, just as you described, like in your own experience, the first step in reading Marx is to read him, is to actually pick up a book, and the book that I would specifically recommend is the Communist Manifesto. It's short, it is clear, it is, I think, a brilliant encapsulation of many of Marx's most important views and methods. And you could read it again. I know this from experience. You could read it again and again and get something new out of it every time. But I think, like a lot of times, Marx is discussed as somebody who's so esoteric and so steeped in mystical Hegelianism, and first of all, what's wrong with that? But like, who's sort of like steeped in mystical Hegelianism and somehow is therefore impenetrable. And I just think that does a disservice to people, because there's lots of Marx that is, I think, pretty readily understandable to lots of folks. And having events like this one, like, you don't have to read it in isolation either. You don't have to be alone, like in your house, like reading Marx. You could read them with friends, and you should, And when I started working on this book, the underpinning for me is a combination of activism that I've been doing, since I got involved in anti-war work in the early 2000s. But also, of course, a key part of the story is, like, thankfully, I had the opportunity and privilege to spend years where my main task that was to read some Marx. I was a grad student, and I was able to kind of take that relatively unusual opportunity and turn it to a revolutionary purpose. But even so, like picking up the manifesto and just reading it together, and just understanding him on his own terms. I think that's the thing that we really fail to do, is to think about Marx on his terms, and that's what I tried to do as much as possible in my book.
I'll just say something very briefly. I mean, I think it's always helpful to start with the biography of Marx and Engels, in the sense that, Marx and Engels were not like that well known in their time, but they were very well known to the socialist leadership of the time. And I think that's essential. They were the mentors of the major socialist figures. And Marxism is an intellectual vocation, I think it must be said, in which any Marxist, if you call yourself a Marxist, one thing to sort of what that signifies is that you are kind of an obsessional, maybe an obsessional neurotic about trying to solve something.
Tell you my secrets.
But really, like you're sort of like infected, right? You're infected with some kind of bug whereby you have something to figure out. There's something to figure out, and you don't know. And this discourse is propelling you along, and you become a gadfly to your family. God bless them, precisely because they see your infection, and they may not be infected, right? So part of it is sort of, not to get antibodies. Your antibodies are found in immersing yourself deeper and going deeper, and there's no limit. There's no limit to how far you can go. And, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about Vanessa's book is, of course, Marxists have been accused of kind of a secular religion because of this infection idea. And there's obviously some truth to that. I mean, one of the best critics of Marxism of the 20th century is this liberal guy who's Polish. He's a former Marxist named Leszek Kołakowski. And he says that the origin of Marxism comes out of Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism, the same Neoplatonism that made St. Thomas Aquinas, a devout Christian. So there is this kind of theological underbelly. Engels would write a lot about the history of Christianity. And for Kolakowski, Marxism is a continuation of Christianity insofar as what Marxism is trying to do is offer redemption at a human level, at a collective level, in the same way that radical Christianity was trying to do in its time. So it's like a new, updated direction that socialist movement could take, right? So there's all kinds of vying intellectual directions of socialism, and Marxism, I think, is seen as evidenced by the fact that the right will call our enemies Marxists, which incidentally was a strategy that, and I'm not calling the right the Nazis, but this is exactly what the Nazis did. It was actually quite an ingenious strategy, which was they sought to argue that mainstream liberalism in Germany was identical to Marxism as a means to shut down the inner debate between liberals and Marxists on the left, which is something I think that we're still facing today. And so Marxism becomes therefore a question of also conversion. And I don't like that phrase. I try to avoid it. But let us be honest if we could, which is if you have the bug, right? If you are infected. I mean, Engels' early text was about the meaning of converting to being a communist, right? Because it was a scandal at the time, and it still is a scandal to some extent, right? I don't think that we need that baggage, right? But I also agree with Vanessa, who articulates very well through the work of Terry Eagleton, that Marxists should not be afraid of associating with religion. Marxism notoriously is known as an atheistic discourse, and many experimentations of state socialism inspired by Marxism were highly critical of state religion, in some cases rightly so, in other cases persecutory towards religion. But I think for us, that's not a contradiction that elevates to a level that is really worthwhile. In other words, to be a Marxist doesn't mean that you need to stop being a Buddhist, a Muslim, or a Christian, which may be an obvious point, but I think worth saying. The only thing I'll say about reading Marx is this: read with a group. Read with a group and read with people that have real expertise. Try to combine both. YouTube is your source. I mean, the David Harvey lectures on Capital are amazing. Michael Heinrich has this wonderful introduction to reading Capital, which helped me immensely before I even started reading the text. Be humble. Reading Capital is hard. It's not easy. This is one final point. Oppenheimer, the movie Hollywood, Oppenheimer as a liberal theory of genius. I love it. He said, yes, I finished Capital on one train ride. He said it. I swear to God, he said it. And then he was at a party and he mistook Marx with Proudhon, which is absolutely criminal because he was a part of the Communist Party. And in real life, I did some research on Oppenheimer. He would never have made that mistake in real life.
If I could just, it's interesting, like this question of religiosity, because there, on the one hand, Marx is, of course, famously extremely hostile to religion and religiosity. It's also, I think, like one of the things that's illuminating about Marx's hostility in this respect is he thinks lots of things count as religiosity. He thinks that liberals' belief in the individuality, freedom, and liberty of the citizen is religiosity. This is what he says in the critique of the on the Jewish question, that it projects into an abstract realm of the merely ideal, the freedom, liberty, individuality, and so on, that doesn't exist for the actual physical human members of society, but that we have in virtue of being citizens, this abstraction. And so this is one of the reasons why I don't think it's so this exchange with Terry Eagleton's book that I engage in my book, it's in some ways a small point because he's arguing that you don't have to be a materialist in order to be a Marxist, and that in order to be what Marx would have recognized as somebody who has the same kind of perspective, historical materialist perspective that he does. That I think is incorrect. I think you clearly cannot believe in a supernatural power and be the kind of materialist that Marx was, right, and that he's describing. On the other hand, as Daniel pointed out, like, I agree that, of course, there have been Christian Marxists and Jewish Marxists and Muslim Marxists. If we understand this as a historical category of people who have aligned themselves with the cause of socialism, have read Marx, have thought about Marx, and have tried to implement Marx, and so that kind of litmus test, I think, is not very useful, especially since lots of self-professed atheists would fail it. And that's the thing that I think really goes missing when we talk about Marx and materialism and atheism and religiosity. That, again, similar to the class issue, he's cutting along lines in a very different way than how we typically do in our everyday discussion.
Just very briefly, I'm going to read one comment we have on the stream. Someone says, infected. Oh, we got a real bad case of the Marxism bug. So to get back to like a little bit of that, both tying into what you were discussing, like that, the religiosity, and I think you make some really great points about how Marx was critiquing atheists and atheism itself as being religious because it's engaging with this question, the way that he kind of, what makes Marx, I think, a little bit difficult is because we all understand Marx as like a political thinker, and Marx is very critical of a lot of tendencies that we see show up in our own daily lives in major world historical events that have shaken our lives and really impacted the way that we've seen things. But it takes a while to really get through. You have to really be infected. You have to really read him and go through and, maybe bring a bunch of books around and have a bunch of people in your life be like, why the hell are you reading that? Until you're finally realizing what he's talking about. Because I think different tendencies and different, historical perspectives have picked up on certain things. And I guess for me, like, I don't think I really got to what it was all about until I was like reading volume 2 of Capital. And that's what I really love about your book is I think you're really drawing out the common threads that underlie everything, the common, fabric, which everything's made of that, a lot of people seem to mistake and seem to not even notice. The way that Marx transcends these debates about not only religion, but also we were talking, as you were mentioning, the faith in liberal values of individuality, of freedom, of equality, what that really means. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the core of Marx's ethical vision, what you kind of draw out in your book and explicate. Like, what is this common vision? What is Marx trying to do? What's the purpose of it all?
Yeah, thank you. So when so a version I wrote about Marx and morality for my dissertation, like back in the day, and then revisited it and sort of came back and kept, I definitely sorry, what did you say? The neurotic, obsessional neurotic. No, I have no idea what Daniel is talking about. That I can't relate, at all. No, that was me. I was just absolutely obsessed because I had to know what does Marx think about ethics. Marx is touting the materialist conception of history as this holistic perspective. He and Engels say that they know just one science, the science of history. And so, all right, cool. That means that you are purporting to have a theory that explains absolutely everything. What about this? What about ethics? And Marx, throughout his writings, is unabashedly normative. He's talking all the time about what should happen and what is criminal, what is vampiric, what is barbarous, about capitalists dragging the rest of us along with them, down into the hecatombs of corpses, right, in their graves. Maybe he needs to be purely scientific and neutral, like maybe, but but it seems as though he thinks it's bad, even immoral. And I wanted to understand that. Ideally wanted to make sense of it, but if nothing else, I wanted to understand what was going on. And as I started, just because I sat down and just started reading Marx. I was like, cool, I'm just gonna read. And there's a lot of Marx out there. And the thing that leapt out to me immediately was, oh my goodness, this guy talks about individuality all the time. And even as someone who by that point considered myself a socialist and had been organizing for several years, I think that was a moment where I really had a new clarity about how brainwashed I was still, like how inundated in this script about what Marx thought, and because that script makes it very surprising that at every turn he's saying we need to promote human individuality. The worst thing about capitalism is that it stultifies it, that it makes it impossible for people to express themselves as unique and self-realizing persons. It's just not what I expected to find. And so it was sort of incredible. So one of the things that I think makes it difficult at times for people to see what is ethical about Marx's perspective is a distinction between the normative and the empirical that makes sense, for most of us, given the way that we've been educated and the way that we've been, given to kind of understand, some things are matters of value or taste or individual preference, and some things are just objective external facts about the world, and ethics cannot have anything to do with the latter. It has to be the former, this purely subjective ideal realm of something like taste, right? And for Marx, that's not what the world is like at all. The world is the social world of human beings is already normative. To make normative claims about how human beings ought to live and how we ought to interact with one another and what our world ought to be like is not just mere kind of subjective personal preference. He takes himself to be interpreting something that already exists as a reality. And the reality is struggle. The reality is resistance, which exists all the time. And what is it a struggle for? Survival. People want to live and not die. They want to have enough food to eat. They want to have clean water. They want to have housing. And that implicit, already inherent, already ongoing, endless struggle that human beings engage in, it takes on different forms in different historical contexts, but it is always the aim of survival is already inherent in human life. He doesn't have to superimpose some extra theoretical assumption onto it, right? And so he's saying, well, okay, here's what human beings are doing. They're trying to survive. Here's how working class people, the majority of people in society, are responding to the fact that capitalism on the log scale is incompatible with human survival. And you don't need theory. You don't need, you need theory, but you don't need theory to know that. you know, and you don't even have to have the full conception that capitalism is incompatible with human survival. All you have to know is that it's incompatible with your survival, that you're not making it, that your bills are unpaid, that your kid is hungry, that your kid is sick, that you're sick, you know, and you can't afford treatment. That's all you have to know, you know, to be engaged in some active resistance. And that resistance could be quite small at times. It could be anything from quitting a job and finding one that pays more money. That's an act of resistance, right? That is you trying to have more ownership over the material resources that you produce, all the way up to organizing and striking, right? All the way up to millions of people getting in the streets and saying we're against this war. So for Marx, you know, the vision is him looking at what human beings are already doing in order to achieve the aim of living and not dying, and asking, okay, if that's our aim, if that's the thing that we're trying to do, if that's the process that we're already involved in, what is the most rational way to do that? And the most rational way to do that is we have to get rid of this system, which is completely incompatible with that. That makes it impossible for us to coordinate our behavior, impossible for us to be good stewards of the earth, impossible for us to even relate to one another as human beings, and not as, you know, to get Kantian for a moment, not as mere means, right, to the end. Of our survival, but to actually see one another as the mutual precondition for our for survival and our flourishing, you know. And so, you know, for that is the ethical vision. That is the ethical vision for Marx. And it also goes to, you know, why, like, there are lots of Marxists, you know, who are very skeptical of the project of trying to find ethical content in Marx, and very skeptical of the kind of my project, right? The kind of thing I'm doing. But I think, you know, I think that skepticism is like totally legitimate, like quite justified, because it's very important not to see Marx as coming up with some alien standard that he then is going to impose upon the working class, or impose as a limitation on the working class's struggle to emancipate itself. It is an ethics that is read off from the work of the working class. I'm learning it from reading history, and that's where Marx learned it from, right? From working people and their struggle. And so, you know, I share the worry about having some kind of abstract, superimposed ethics onto working people, but that's the opposite, right, of what Marx is doing and of what I'm doing.
It's always interesting because in a certain way, Marx invents what he and Engels call historical materialism. And one way to understand what that means is that the history of society is driven by what they call class struggles, right? And so if you have a maxim or sort of a slogan by which a class coheres its identity or rallies around, say like freedom or equality or liberty, right? One of the claims that Marx and Engels make is that the structure of modern capitalism presents a distinct standpoint and worldview that treats these abstract categories of values differently based on class, position, and experience. So Engels, in his later work, a text called Anti-Düring, would argue for something called proletarian morality, right? Which is not a morality that is conceiving of morals in some ultra nominalist abstract ideal realm, but rather that pregnant within the promises of bourgeois society, the maxims that brought about bourgeois society have been lost to the dominant class of that society. So therefore, the slogans that they continue to say are therefore empty. And I think we see this today. Why was it that all of the Obama incarnations were nothing but shallow and empty, whereas this relatively uncharismatic senator from Vermont somehow didn't have to use highfalutin slogans, but like got way more support. Now, I'm not endorsing Sanders because unfortunately, I think from a Marxist point of view, Sanders has made a lot of strategic errors, which is a whole other point. But you see, the point is that Marx and Engels point to the contradiction of class and freedom, right? And the way that we latch onto our political values are classed. Now, that is a traumatic truth, that fact that I just said, I think, because that means that social reality is driven by our class. And so if there is something like a proletarian morality, what that means is that it's a type of morality that the working class is distinctly capable of bringing about, which is what? Which is the promise, and this is, I think, a question of somewhat of a debate about finishing the project of freedom that opened the revolutionary tradition, say in France, Great French Revolution. And Marx and Engels are saying, well, they're part of this group called the Communist League, and they're saying, wait a second, all of you guys are heady intellectuals, and you're creating slogans to try to revolutionize society, but ultimately, you're really what they call the true socialists. Your slogans are kind of empty abstractions that are not connecting to workers. So Marx and Engels have this section in the Communist Manifesto that I always read and reread to understand this, because we also have to be humble, which is that we are, some of us may by origins be of a working class, but we're also thrown into a professional milieu in which the intersection of class experience is contradictory for ourselves. So when we are trying to be on the side of that kind of liberation that Marx and Engels are talking about, we have to ask, what are the preconditions of that? And one of the things that Marx and Engels will say when they break from this group called Communist League is that really all of the predominant socialist intellectuals are only able to remain within what they called contemplation. And so therefore their theories of revolution were somewhat narcissistic ultimately. And that then becomes a danger internal to the Marxist cadre, the Marxist effort, which is what? Which is the necessity to mediate our work with labor. And I'll say one final thing that is a struggle here, which is that bourgeois society is structured in such a way at its governmental level, at the state level, to bar the labor movement. As a result, like say if you have a socialist state in a Leninist framework, the function of the Marxist intellectual is not to produce abstract ideas. The function of the Marxist intellectual is to be a coordinator and an organizer for the interests of labor, right? To center the working class at an institutional level and at a nexus of power. We in this society, after the reforms of neoliberalism in the 1970s, financialization, the fragmentation of the workers' movement, and many other factors, we face a different challenge, which is we have an alienated working class. We have a distance from their empowerment within institutions. And so we live in a world which is almost like a petri dish of education in Marxist thought. And one of the lifelines that we want to give to workers are books, are ideas, is Marxist literature itself, which we shouldn't say, oh, it means nothing. No, it means a great deal, because I do agree with Lenin's basic idea that within the workers' movement, not everyone is going to be infected. And that's okay. But Lenin would say that everyone wants freedom, right? So there is a levels of intensity, and Marx will say ever since he founded historical materialism that the workers' movement has to be seized by revolutionary theory as a precondition. That is a precondition for its success. So that doesn't make this a work in vain, right? It does mean, though, that we need to find ways to circumvent these institutional barriers that block thinkers from the working class. And also, and I'll stop here. As I mentioned before, Marxism envisions what an intellectual is. An intellectual is not an academic, right? Every worker is also an intellectual. So there's a radical egalitarianism. Like tomorrow, I have the great pleasure of interviewing Jacques Rancière. And he's this French philosopher who put forward these studies of the working class movement in the 19th century. And he started from the premise, which is a really interesting premise, which is not from on high, but he went and he found all of the Marxist intellectuals who were workers that never got published and wrote at night. And he studied their texts as if they were the equivalent to Plato. And he shows what their frameworks of freedom and liberation were. They were not master intellectuals. No, they were autodidacts. They were working purely for the love of their own freedom. Purely, not narcissistically. Because that's the other thing. It's like, is our endeavors in vain? No, I would say actually what Marxism shows is there's a fundamental interwoven nature to the pursuit of revolutionary theory with the actual struggle. They have to fuse. That's our task, to show how they can fuse for ourselves and for others.
Thank you both. So I think I might ask one or two more questions before we move into Q&A. But with a couple threads that you've both talked about, I think first of all, what you mentioned, Vanessa, like when you're talking about how you were reading Marx after having been in the socialist milieu and being like, wait, this guy's talking about individual freedom all the time. People just pick the mic up over there. Sorry. Just like to, yeah, turn it back over. Sorry, it fell over. Sorry. All right, I have to make sure our friends on stream can hear. We have 29 other people in the room with us virtually. But Daniel, with you, when you mentioned how like some of our values and our political views, are very classed, and I think especially in the United States, how the working class today is very like culturally divided. Sometimes even the same bourgeois values of freedom and equality in some ways have been polarized. And I think you do a great job in the book of talking about how on bourgeois terms these values have been very much fulfilled. But even today, like I think when I was reading Marx and really getting to this core of like, wait, this guy's really talking about individual freedom. My whole life I've been told that libertarians or conservatives, and I grew up in a more like liberal kind of area. My whole life I'm told, oh, like these people are like talk about freedom and individuality, and maybe some of like the left milieus that I was in kind of like counterpose that with like what you would I think call in your book like kind of like a gray collectivism, where it's like, oh, like no, we're taking this other side. This is what we're supposed to be about in reaction to this, about equality and about the collective. And I think that kind of like that split is especially kind of like visible in bourgeois politics as it kind of like fragments. And I think just in general, like people on the left maybe like seeing what goes on with capitalism and kind of like inverting that and being like, okay, this is how capitalism and capitalist society talks about itself. I'm suffering, I'm having these experiences, and they kind of just invert that and they counterpose that. I guess I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the moral core and how that really like Marx's ethics, which are rooted in dialectics, kind of goes beyond the moral terms themselves, but also these struggles for survival, these acts of resistance that working people do, how they're pointing to something that a lot of these values in their simple terms would sort of point to, but how it's something in some ways like richer. That's what Marx and Marxism is kind of getting at. What is kind of that like beyond like that categorical imperative? Like how does it impel us to act today? What's really the beyond that we're kind of like fighting for?
Yeah, it's
There's a couple of things I want to say. So one, I mean, the question of individuality, just to sort of close that loop, like part of what's going on there is an undialectical approach, right, to thinking about the relationship between individual and society. Um, and navigating the apparent contradiction between individual and society is one of the central problems of liberal political theory in general, right? And especially in its social contractarian forms, where the whole problem is supposed to be, damn it, there's all these other individuals around, and they want things, and I want everything. And so these other people are a hard limit on my exercise of my individual freedom. And how do we deal with that, right? And then the answer is society, as a kind of second best to me just being a lone atom standing on my own with my unfettered access to everything. But of course, the whole problem, when put in those terms, of course, completely allied to the fact that there is no everything to be had without society. It's just me out in the woods, which I don't know. I like camping, so maybe that's hard, but like I need a tent. I need, so like the emergent, like to even imagine myself as that person with those desires, wanting those things, already presupposes a whole lot of sociality, right, that goes into my even being there, right, to imagine myself in those circumstances. And one of the things that is distinctive about Marx is precisely, as you said, like he doesn't just say, "Oh, you're for individuality? Cool, I'm for collectivism in the most gray, nondescript, self-abnegating way possible." But no, the whole for Marx, he sees himself as overcoming the shortcomings of a political perspective that forces you to constantly think of individuality and sociality as being in tension, as one of those being a problem for the other, when actually they are mutually co-constituting. You can't have one without the other. The premise of individuality is society, and his concept of the social individual is one that he develops precisely to capture that fact. Similarly, thinking about issues of freedom and necessity or freedom and determinism, oftentimes the sort of individual society break interestingly tracks, right, exactly the same kinds of social problems as freedom and determinism, because the mass, right, society is this like lawgiver that is imposing on my individual freedom to do whatever it is that my will would have me do on that given day. But if we think instead that actually the existence of other people, of us in community with one another, of us producing in ways that drastically multiplies the range of options available for me as I decide how to spend my time, whether I'm going to make art, whether I'm going to sing, whether I'm going to visit a friend's baby, whether I'm going to, cook that day, or whether I'm going to sit down and do philosophy. All of that, like my freedom, right, to do all of those things is produced precisely by society and by the features of human social life that do emerge necessarily out of the struggle of people trying to survive and doing it together, doing it collectively, doing it in a coordinated and collaborative fashion. And then the question of how to make it so that the people, the public, society, the community doesn't manifest as this seeming limitation on my freedom is then to reconcile the relationship that I have to society, so that that's what real democracy is, right? Being a part of the decision making, being part of deliberation, being collaborative, right? Having communal control over our lives and over the conditions in which we make our lives. That is the kind of real democratic striving that makes genuine freedom and fully self-realized individuality possible. And so that's how I would capture what I take to be the thing that Marx is striving at, right? That we are always already making our lives, but we're often doing it under very constrained conditions and with very little information. And how could we overcome that so that we could make our lives in as informed and rational a way as possible? And this is why the category of labor this is what I center in my book, because for Marx, the most important thing is the concept of labor, and labor that Marx describes as the activity of human self-changing. Because we're always already creating ourselves, creating our communities, creating our lives. And the question is, how can we do that in a conscious and rational way?
I really love the part of your book, Vanessa, in which you discuss the invention of new social needs that will come as a result of participation in the project of building worker power. Because Marx was about that. I mean, Marx gave a letter once to a Civil War general that I always love to cite, where the Civil War general by the name of Wedemeyer asked Marx, so what's your most important idea? And Marx said, well, it's not exactly class struggle, because the bourgeois economists kind of had a premonition of that. My most important idea is that class struggle needs to be continued for the organization of the working class, what they used to call the dictatorship of the proletariat. After the 20th century, you can't quite use the dictatorship term for various reasons, but what is the actual essence of the meaning of that phrase? It is about the necessity for the overcoming of the bourgeois system, of this form of society which permits the degradation and the stripping of the dignity of more than half of its citizens day in and day out, and then deprives them even of having the language to name that crime, right? It's not even, I would even say if today the working class suffers from a kind of irrational rerouting of their antagonism onto fake cultural objects, or say Donald Trumpism, for example, what goes missing in that is this sort of root, right? And that's what Marxism sort of reminds us, the educational project of Marxism, which is, I think, that the root of alienation in capitalism is not easy to name. And this, I think, is why liberalism can actually, in some sense, succeed over Marxism in the public sphere, because liberalism is happy to have a very broad tent in terms of how it names oppressions, right? And this is a debate that I get in with a lot of Marxists, because one of the responses that Marxists will have to liberalism is the idea that really, no. All that really matters is working class oppression, right? That's all that really matters. And you guys are off here talking about X, Y, Z. You're not talking about day-to-day exploitation. Let's talk about exploitation. And I don't know what you think about this, Vanessa, but I have found myself in debates with Marxists because I'm of the mind that Marxists need to center both, right? It's what one great Italian Marxist philosopher calls the paradigm of exploitation through self-evidence, right? Which is that every worker will know the reality of our failures by waking up in the morning. Self-evident, that the direction of this society is not going in our way. But then we have to also recognize another paradigm that the class struggle takes in our society, which takes on a multiplicity. It takes on a multiplicity in which there are class struggles internal to nations. There's class struggles internal to the bourgeoisie. There's alienation that the bourgeoisie experiences, which is another reason I love Vanessa's section about the topic of what you might call class traders, And what does that look like? Right? Exactly, given the news, right? What does that look like? Obviously, Marxism, unlike religious communism, mind you, was always on the side of welcoming a multiplicity, of a conception of class struggle. As I always say, when the Civil War was initiated by John Brown, Marx and Engels shared a letter and they said, we want the slaves to lead their emancipation, freedom struggle. It didn't happen that way, but did Marx and Engels say, oh, that's all that matters, we're not going to even take a side in this? No, they took a fucking side, right? I think Marxism shows you always have to take a side in the struggle, and that the struggle appears, not always how you want it to appear. We may be able to remind liberals of the kind of root of exploitation, and we should. We should always do that, but we should never fetishize that as the only source of suffering. Because when we do that, they call us class reductionists, and they're right. We don't want to be like that. We actually don't want to be like that. But at the same time, we have to recognize that liberals don't want to say anything about that because they want that to go unchecked. But we're not content to let. I mean, what was the slogan of Eugene Debs, probably the greatest socialist in America, when he ran for president? He said, who will be the John Brown of wage slavery, right? Because he saw the struggle for the freedom and emancipation in a dialectic. Wage labor was next. We have not served the cause of Debs. We can't even talk about universal health care in these goddamn presidential elections, right? Let alone something as ambitious as that. But that was the cornerstone of the socialist movement. So I think we just need to, we need to recenter ourselves with Marx, but also with our tradition, which is also very much tradition rooted here in these lands.
Yeah, one of the questions that really animated this book for me was, what is the relationship between just a good old bread and butter philosopher's question? What is the relationship between matter and ideas? And one way of looking at Marx and thinking about Marx and thinking about what materialism must mean is, as we discussed a moment ago, oh, well, he's just talking about the law-like deterministic mechanisms of material reality, and ethics has nothing to do with that. But that is clearly not Marx's way of thinking about materialism. He takes himself precisely to have superseded and surpassed that kind of mechanistic materialism. He is a Hegelian, which is one of the things that I really take up centrally in my book. And among many things that means, one of them is that it would be really surprising if Marx thought just one side of that dialectic of matter and ideas was real or had significance, because even Hegel, who was a philosophical idealist, who thought that ideas were the sort of fundamental determining aspect of being, thought that matter was quite important, right? And thought that you couldn't have development in the realm of ideals unless you also had transformation that took place politically and materially in the empirical material world. So it would be really strange for Marx to then move backward to a kind of very simplistic, like Newtonian physics kind of model of human beings. It would be strange. And similarly, in thinking about the relationship between identity-based oppression and then economic exploitation, that also tracks this question of the relationship between ideas and matter. And often interpreters of Marx who don't understand dialectics, don't really understand the history of materialism, they just assume that to be a Marxist is not to care about the racist ideas that people have, or about the racist affect that they might bear, or the way that racism might affect a human being on a experiential, emotional, and psychological level. But there's nothing about Marx's materialism which is entirely about the relationship between ideas and matter, where he's talking about a theory of how the material conditions, they set the stage for what kinds of ideas we can expect to emerge and what kinds of ideas we can expect people to hold. But then the ideas that we have react back onto the world, right, which we act upon on the basis of our conception of it. And I think there's, in my work, I've tried to demonstrate that there's lots of really useful resources in Marx for thinking about categories of identity-based oppression. But, and here's where the rubber does meet the road with materialism. I do not think that we can hope to overcome any form of identity-based oppression as long as we've got capitalism around, right? And that's the thing that a Marxist perspective prevents you from believing, right? It makes it impossible to have the hope that somehow we can do away with racist oppression, with homophobia, with sexism, with transphobia, and still have a system that prevents us from even seeing one another as human beings, even if we try. Like, we can't really. And a system that depends on us being divided against one another. And I'll just wrap up that thought with saying, the elephant in the room, in every room I'm in anyway, is of course the killing of the United Healthcare CEO last week, and it is like a stunning demonstration of the relationship between matter and ideas, that the ruling class does everything they can to control our ideas, to tell us what to feel, to tell us what is right and what's wrong. It's a question about class morality is what's at stake. We're being told it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. Well, then why isn't it wrong when you're putting people in the ground for a line on next year's report to your shareholders? Why isn't that wrong? Don't worry about that. Don't think too hard. It's just not wrong. It is everything's good and right about it. And I think the thing that is really disturbing many of people at the top of society is that it's not just the lefties. Listen, Ben Shapiro's mentions are in shambles, over this, and the thing is, whatever ideas you have in your head about capitalism, about the right to make a profit, about the values of human lives, we cannot escape the basic material fact, just as Marx and Engels wrote at the beginning of the introduction to the Critique of the German Ideology. The first premise is human beings. It is actual human beings existing in the world and trying to survive that world that they're in. And everybody's got a body. It doesn't matter what you think, right? In that head of yours, everybody, I mean, you all know this, but everybody has a body. Everybody has a body, and that body gets sick. That body gets cancer. That body gets autoimmune disease, right? You break bones in that body. Everybody has a body. And no matter what it is that your preconceived sort of political opinion is, that body could get sick. And when it gets sick, it needs medicine. And you can't get it. And everybody knows why. Everybody knows it's because of Brian Thompson. Everybody knows it's because of capitalism. Everybody knows it's because of the shareholders. Everybody knows that. You can't hide it. And it's such an amazing example of Marx's argument that the ideas that people have at the end of the day are shaped by their material circumstances.
All right. Thank you very much, Vanessa and Daniel. Before we break for questions, I just want to read one part of your book that you touch on. Throughout a couple of the points in the book, you identify what you think of as Marx's version, Marx's categorical imperative, which is a quote, and I think this is very apt given what we were just talking about. what you would say Marx's categorical imperative is to quote, to overthrow all relations in which man is a debased, enslaved, forsaken, despicable being. So with that, who would like to start with a question? All right. Yeah. we can do- No, the other one's for the stream.
Thanks. Thanks for this conversation. This has been really enjoyable. I was struck by the feeling, especially early on when you were talking about like paths to Marxism, how you became Marxists. Like, haven't we been here before? If you were each twice your own age, right? Then you could like I could easily mistake you for like new leftists from the 60s, telling me, right? Like, look, man, it wasn't just Vietnam, right? It was the civil rights movement, it was the crisis in 73, right? And they also had this moment where they like kind of, they had this return to Marx, this rediscovery of Marx, right? That they felt they could kind of read anew against the misreading that they thought had been subjected to by what they called the old left, right? And so I'm thinking, like, what does it mean that we might find ourselves apparently back in the same spot now, a generation later, right, as millennials, saying like, oh, maybe the problem still is that we need to get past this old left reading of Marx, right, and read him anew. And I just wanted to tag onto that like, one key difference between our moment and the moment of the 60s that you pointed out was we can't presume that anyone's read Marx anymore. Whereas the new leftists did take for granted that there was kind of a received Marx that people knew about. And it's not clear to me, is that an advantage for us? Or is that actually like, have conditions just kind of degraded, right? So what does it mean that we're like returning to Marx?
Do we want to do a stack of questions, or do we want to do just like one by one?
I think one by one, and I'll try to be
I'll hang out.
pithy.
I'll hang out.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And it's so one great irony of my work is that I think it was about maybe 2007 or so when I was like, this is it. This is the question, Marx and ethics. And at that time, almost universally, the response was, oh, haven't we already done that? Like this, oh my gosh, it's done, it's been done. And and the reason I say it's an irony is that, in 2007, that's what people were saying. In 2024, people are like, whoa, this is very fresh, So it's kind of crazy. Like 17 years later, that's the, but because, and it happens for exactly the reason you point out, right? Times change, conditions change, context changes, the people we're talking to change. Some of you, did you exist? Maybe there's probably at least one of you who like didn't exist, at that point, but yeah, I mean, so I'll say like, I don't see myself as necessarily trying to put forward like a new reading to supplant the old. Like that's not necessarily how I contextualize my work. I do, because it's not so much like left readings of Marx that I really have my issue with. It is what is actually dominant in our context, which is sort of liberal readings of Marx. And that really speaks to exactly what you're describing, like the assumption that I might be speaking to an audience that is already steeped in Marxist ideas. I'm not able to make that assumption. And I don't, like, the book is written assuming the person reading it knows nothing about Marx. Is it good or bad? I mean, it's definitely mostly bad that, but it does present an opportunity. It does mean that people approach Marx freshly. And that's better than them, saying like, oh God, we've already been there, done that. It's a much more open kind of discursive context.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I resonate with your question very much. It's very dear to me in the sense that I cut my teeth in French theory. And, one of the things that French theory was trying to do, which, even is reflective in most academic milieus today, is to sort of say that, which is an insight of Foucault, right? Which is that Marx is fundamentally of the 19th century and we need to move on. And as such, strategically, that means something, which is that we have a new revolutionary agent, and that is students and what they call the new social movement. And my reading, after witnessing what happened in Gaza and witnessing various sort of fits and starts from the anti-globalization movement on through to the wave of the populist movement with Corbyn and Sanders, is that this notion of the centering of a replacement of the working class as the agency of what the left latches its conception of freedom and liberation to is no longer going to be sufficient, right? So like it or not, I think that the new left experimentation, broadly speaking, is very difficult to sustain. And the reality is that most Marxists win along with the replacement of the centering of the working class. I think the debate now reflects more of a debate internal to the left with liberals around their phobias and their fears of losing their own centeredness. Because liberals have the kind of luxury to think anything can be the centered agency, right? Going back to things she was saying regarding individualism. And Marxists are a little bit more persnickety, which is okay, right? We get in trouble for being like very insistent upon this. But I think we need to fall back on Lenin's point that it's strategic. We are not trying to fetishize or deify the working class. We are being strategic. And there is a whole history behind us, right? I mean, Marx's debates with Bakunin, with Proudhon, with utopian socialists, all of those debates showed kind of like the superiority of the praxis at a strategic level of Marxism. And I would even say one of the things of our time, of our future, is how we look in a dialectical way to China and its socialism, all of its impurity, all of its flaws, all of its authoritarianism, does not negate the fact of what Mao did, right? And how do we learn from that? Do we look at it like Adorno looked at it, as just like there's nothing really to salvage there? I think he said once about the legacy of Maoism. The new left also experimented with Maoism. We're not really doing that. Trotskyism, as far as I can tell, is largely defunct. You know what I'm saying? In terms of its actual connection to the workers' movement. So we have the benefit of being in somewhat of virginal territory as Marxists. I don't know if it's a benefit that people don't read Marx as much. Maybe it is if you're a writer. You can, I don't know. We can talk about that later over drinks. So we are and we are not the new left, right? We are and we are not. I think that we're facing a situation of capitalist crises that are so interconnected once we add global climate change into the mix that fundamentally makes our existential predicament so different than the 68ers, right? The revolution of everyday life and the counterculture of the 68 movement is no longer possible on today's left at all, which is a blessing. We are not a counterculturalist left. Capitalism is proven to fully, look at the counterculture right now in New York, the thing called Dime Square is the most like apolitical, like there's not even, they had this reactionary socialist go there and give a lecture. And I thought to myself, wait a second, all of these avant-garde artists in New York with Dime Square, they wouldn't even have anything to say about socialism, right? They're checked out, right? So I think that this new left revolution of everyday life kind of mantra is not, we're not an aesthetic left anymore, right? Our situation is more dire, it is more desperate. And that maybe is a blessing for us.
Or not.
Well, it makes us be a lot more optimistic, All right, thank you. Next question. Maybe not optimistic, but like to see pessimism.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
How y'all doing?
All right.
I'm doing good. Yeah. Really just thank you for coming here today and speaking with us. And I've learned a tremendous amount as a baby Marxist myself. I'm out here trying to get the shit, you know, but this is a more of a serious question as someone who is expanding more into Marxism and trying to understand praxis in this regard. And in my just to share my own personal context, I'm from down south. There's a lot of, you know, blue dog democratic ideology down south, and especially for those of us who might exist in the intersections of being like, you know, from the south, black Christian, etc. In my upbringing, Marxism made things more left leaning in the more predominantly white southern spaces that I had to fight to be in, was considered, you know, satanic or evil, etc. In a lot of the black and brown communities that I was part of down south, now that I'm more active in more like working class spaces in the South and in DC, that have exposed me more to Marxist thought. However, growing up, even the thought of the Black Panther Party, who had a lot of Marxist practices and how they moved and was since and then fell apart, unfortunately, in a lot of ways. But my parents' generation, you know, they saw Dr. King and many of the great leaders of the movement get murdered, and they not necessarily lost hope, but kind of fell into more neoliberal ways of thinking. And I don't put that against them by any means. So my question really is honestly, how can we contextualize Marx in a way that doesn't bastardize the text and Marx's work, while also helps to contextualize to those of us who are from Black and Brown and Latina and in other contexts, you know, in the South, or, you know, exist in working class contexts that I don't want to assume that working class people aren't educated, but like Marxism always personally to me felt more in the collegiate intellectual spirit. And all of us are intellectuals as workers, like period. Like that is a truth that we can sit on and stand strong on. But for our folk in the fight who don't have the BAs or MAs or PhDs, how can we bring this to them in a way that they feel empowered? The text isn't lost and all their identity is affirmed, because I really think that's a huge part of how we can move into a new left, into a new revolutionary thought. So thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so there's going to be it's going to depend, of course, quite a bit on the particular context. But as you're speaking, it just occurs to me that often the best way to bring Marxist analysis into non-academic spaces, spaces that aren't specifically marked as, you know, sort of intellectual spaces, is to supply that analysis yourself in conversation, right? You know, and it doesn't have to be, you know, as a Marxist, I think, but just having just like you educating yourself, right, and reading Marx and thinking about, and not just also not just Marx, right, reading various kinds of Marxist analysis. I plug for my journal. I'm one of the co-editors of Spectre Journal, which is a journal of Marxist theory and analysis. Thank you, Sam. Yeah, be like Sam. Love Spectre. You know, we operate on such a shoestring budget, but we put in a lot of effort, a lot of time to try to publish great works of Marxist analysis of contemporary and ongoing events. So all of that, but you know, it doesn't have to, it could be something like giving your coworker an article that you've read recently that is about the thing you talked about in the break room the other day, you know, but also it could just be you yourself educating yourself and becoming, if you're already somebody who's asking that question, then you are by definition a leader and an educator. And so then the question is treating yourself like that, right? Regarding your, like the vector of Marxist analysis and theory in that space is you. You're going to be the best right, educational element there. And so having those kinds of conversations, and then when people ask, well, how did you come up with that? Why do you think that? Man, he said this person said something really smart the other day, and could you say that again? And then people start to ask, like, and then the answer is, well, have I told you the good news about communism? And that's what happened to me. I wasn't a Marxist. I wasn't like everything I had learned about Marxism made it just seem like kind of nuts. But I wanted to work to oppose the war, and then I just saw that the people who were clearest, who had the best analysis, who were steadfast in their opposition, who were still there the day after Kerry lost the 2004 election, but were the Marxists. And that was when I really became interested. That it was after that election when I looked around and saw who was still standing and ready to fight. That's how I got interested. And I think, for anybody who's wondering, how do you have to like be an example of how a person, which all of which is true, an example of how a person just gets a lot smarter once they once they become a communist, and like, that's a true thing. All of you listening at home, like, become a communist. Like, all of a sudden you'll be a lot more analytically clear. But then it's left up to other people to notice that, for them to come to that conclusion about you. I mean, in my view, I think that's the way to go about it.
I mean, I think like the narrative of how militant revolutionaries used Marxism in the 20th century in the global South would likely resonate with many of your comrades, to share those narratives of liberation, and how Marxism was not only just a theory or a philosophy, but was actually this practical device for the development of a whole nation, all throughout Africa, all throughout the Far East. All the anti-colonial stuff was using, I mean, the pinnacle. I mean, we just did a wonderful event, some of you were there, on CLR James. And James is one of the great contributors to the fusion of the Black radical tradition with Marxism in the US. And what did he do? He took the most philosophical, abstract text of Marx, and he brought it into the Ford Motor Plant in Detroit. And during lunch breaks would just have people read the text. He and his colleague had just translated it. So, I think that's the other thing is, like, Marx, if you read the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, it's so rich, and yet it's like kind of, you understand half of it, but that's okay. In the same way you learn to swim, you jump into the deep end and you just sort of do it. You never know what that effect that will have on someone. And so I would also never shy from that. Use hagiography of revolutionary history. And frankly, I'll say one other thing, especially for folks that deal with racialization. Alert people to the fact that the intelligence apparatus after the Second World War has systematically tried to divert radical Black movements away from Marxism. And there's a long history of the CIA doing that. I don't want to overblow that, but it is important because it shows the threat of the teaching, right? Okay, so.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to follow up with that, because I think that is so important. It's so important when we talk about why is it that there appears to be this fissure between left ideas, Marxist ideas, and this idea that Marxism is either has nothing to say about race, or that it is itself a racist viewpoint. I mean, it is wild, and I encounter this often also in academic spaces, where people will say, oh, well, Marxists never talked about race. They didn't think about, when the absolute majority of Marxists historically have been people of color. Like, it's almost unquestionable. Like, I haven't sat down and counted, but when you think about the legacy of Marxist movements all across the global South, it just seems to be clear that like the absolute majority of Marxists who've ever lived, right, they're not academic Marxists, but they are people who are trying to live and not die. Just like I said, they're trying to survive, and they're looking for the theory that best helps explain how to survive. And people turn to Marx again and again. Yeah, and I think the sort of role of the actual physical destruction of those Black leaders who turned towards socialist ideas cannot be overstated, right? What a terrible effect that has had on making sure that those movements remain severed. And part of our work is to undo that.
Thank you both. Before our last question, I want to let you all know the kitchen at Sunny's is going to be closing in about 15 minutes. So if you'd like to order something, maybe try to run over or do so now. And with that, I will do our last question. I did see that hand first, or maybe we can do a rock, paper, scissors or something. Yeah, we could just do a stack.
I'm going to stand because I'm in this sort of weird corner. And mine might be quick also, some more people, because it sort of jumps off of what other people have said in a lot of ways. And also what you've said, Vanessa and Daniel. And one other thing, when you said that sort of being a communist makes you smarter, I saw a tweet once that said, I traded being the smartest liberal for the dumbest Marxist, which I think a lot about. So kind of on this, you mentioned that in 2007, people thought that this was a very stale kind of idea, or this had been kind of, hashed out. And then in 2024, it feels kind of fresh again. And so I wanted to ask you a kind of question about strategy in some ways, or about the salience of really emphasizing the ethical dimension here. And it's kind of an intra-left problem because, I think for me, my background's in populism studies, all this sort of stuff. I think populism remains kind of hegemonic on the left in terms of what people think about when they think about the left. I saw plenty of people who consider themselves Marxists even, after Kamala lost, Bernie Sanders put out this message, and it felt like I was an undergraduate and it was 2015 again. And it was like, it feels like this circle goes round and round. But one thing about the populists is like, they do have an ethics and they have a normative vision. And it's actually very little besides that, actually, what the kind of Leclaudians and Muffians would call like the people versus the oligarchy, or this sort of thing. I mean, there is a normative vision there. There is an ethics there. So I think when you said, oh, it feels fresh again in 2024, do you see it as maybe an entry point to get out of this sort of interregnum? Is it a way to kind of capture that energy that is still kind of just like, we're all kind of just swimming in it and breathing it as the air, that like, if you think about yourself as a leftist, you can call yourself a Marxist, but like when the populists come along, you have to sort of fall in line and get on board, it's so pertinent still. And so I'm curious if like you see this book and this project now as a way of kind of breaking that impasse. Thanks.
Hi, I was just wondering, it was mentioned earlier that I think both of you said this at different points, that essentially what drew you to Marxism was that it had, the best analysis, and it was, these were like the most dedicated people in the, whatever struggles you were involved in. I was just wondering, since we also mentioned earlier that, there's basically as many flavors of Marxism as there are Marxists, how I guess, is there like a kind of artificial division here between like ideologies that have very little in common with each other, except calling back to this guy, Marx, Like, I feel like there might be people on the left that consider themselves to be part of wildly different traditions that actually have a great deal of things in common with each other, but very little in common with other people in their own quote unquote traditions. So did I ask a question in there? I'm sorry. Okay, cool. Just making sure I got it.
This is going to be the last one of the night. I think we can stay up here for a little bit. I'm just going to run to it.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you both for this really exceptional talk. I think the one thing that unites my question with the others is that modern kind of political events and happenings have sort of drawn us to Marxism as a way to sort of understand the world around us when everything else has failed. So, like many people, I've been trying to sort of reckon with Trump's reelection beyond just kind of casting off the people who voted for him as completely irredeemable. I feel like I'm in a similar position as I was in 2016, 2017 when I was first introduced to Marx. So I'm wrestling with this question that's kind of a general, broad question, but it's something that I've been wrestling with for a long time, and I feel like you both are the perfect people to ask about. What are your kind of thoughts between a sort of causality between a moral revolution and a political/economic revolution? Do you think that we need a kind of moral revolution to achieve economic liberation? What would that look like? Or do you think that the only way that a moral revolution will be realized is if we kind of take that first step to meet people's material needs? And I think what complicates this even more are the events of the last couple of weeks and, showcasing that things that maybe are not considered quote unquote moral, there's clearly a reason why people are being pushed to act in these quote unquote extreme ways because of the systems of oppression that we're living under. So thank you.
Oh, no, I'm maybe I would wait though.
Yeah, you will.
Yeah. Like times two.
All right. You also want my PA?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll have what he's having. Yeah. So I think I can answer those three questions in one answer. So I think in general, and I'm talking to you, hi. I think in general, it's actually not as bad as that the traditions are so far away that they might as well not even be considered as sharing a tradition. I think generally speaking, it's not that bad. But this is something that comes up in my book because what is most prominent in the world of Anglophone academic philosophy, which is my field, is a version of Marxism that is called analytical Marxism. And it defines itself by rejecting the notion of methodological holism. So the idea that that social being constitutes a unity, right? And instead will take up things like rational choice theory. So just think about people as lots of individuals trying to look after themselves. And also rejects the idea of dialectics. Now, I'm of the opinion that if you don't believe in dialectics and you're not a methodological holism, that's not a Marxist. And I don't necessarily think it's necessarily worth like fighting about too much. In my book, I just say whatever we want to say about this particular school of thought, if we're trying to understand Marx, we're going to have to understand him as a dialectician and a methodological holist, right? So I think sometimes these things come up, but for the most part, I think it's not quite as bad, but it is a salient concern, to be thinking about why do we think of ourselves as sharing a tradition. So this comes back to first and third questions, which both I think are about who cares about morality, right? Why what is the why think about this? And I have a couple of reasons. One, I think one thing that often happens in Marx interpretation is people will share Marx's goal, right? So they'll say, I too believe in the brotherhood of man, and I too want everybody to have enough to eat, and so on. I just disagree that we need revolution to get there, or I just disagree that the working class is the element in history that is going to get us there, or I just disagree that class struggle is going to be part of the story of how we get there. But those are the things that distinguish Marx, from Christianity, for example, from other kinds of theories about how to navigate this seeming yawning chasm between the world as it is and the world as it should be, the world as we want it to be, a world that we can survive and flourish in. And converting Marxism into just a moral theory, into just a normative claim about what ought to be, is to cut it off at the knees, because precisely what makes Marxist theory novel in its time, distinctive, uniquely valuable, is not that it identifies the same end that human beings had already been explicitly articulating for millennia, right? By the time Marx gets around to writing, but that he's figured out how we can actually do it, how we can actually get there, right? How it is that the processes already unfolding are headed in that direction, but will never get us there unless we to understand them consciously and intervene actively as agents, right? And as social agents. So, can thinking about ethics help us in this particular moment? I really do think so. I might have written this book anyway, even if I thought, but I'm extra excited about it because I do think, this is a really a special moment, to be thinking about these things, to say, what, we don't have to settle for mere ethical longing. We can actually get there. We can certainly make things a whole lot better. But, the flip side of that is that it is the working class or nothing. It really is. The working class struggle is our only hope. That's one of the lessons of my book, and it's a lesson that I'm just learned from Marx, right? It's the only hope, because what it is ultimately is the concrete determinate appearance of human beings' self-creation. That's what working class struggle is. It is the majority of human beings on behalf of the species as a whole intervening into the world and transforming it. That's what labor is. That's what working class struggle is. That's what the struggle for communism is.
Wow. I'm sold. I'm signed up. No, Aaron, I love your question about populism and moralism, because at first blush, it would appear that they have the corner on Marxists precisely because they're not afraid of moralizing. And I think that Vanessa's model gives us a lot to work with in this kind of philosophical notion that Marx, you could say, already accounts for a broader conception of human flourishing through this idea of this kind of original Aristotelian notion. But that Marx, unlike the populist vision, points to a more comprehensive account of the multiplicity of points of alienation in capitalism. And ultimately, there's nothing we can build off of what is truly a kind of quasi-religious conception that does deify the underdog in this kind of false two-class theory that populism operates from. So this is something that I think Marxists should be in that arena, which is why, like, Debs was always in that arena. Everyone needs to, as a Marxist, I think, to your question, think very carefully about what the meaning of sectarianism is today. Because there's two kinds, I would say. There's sectarianism internal to hardcore Marxists, where all of the core presuppositions of Marx we agree upon them. Then within that, we had something historically called the International. And that was an organization that housed all of these various tendencies, at which point that institution allowed for something productive to come from the internal squabbles. They were not just the mere narcissism of small differences. But without the International, without that body that can house these theoretical debates and differences, they really seem like the narcissism of small differences amongst scholars, right? The other kind of problem we have is, of course, the question of post-Marxism. And here it becomes a question is sort of like, how far are you willing to go? How far are you willing to deviate and still allow this to be qualified as Marxist? And I don't want to be like a Marxist Salafi. Do you know what I mean? I don't think that's necessary. I think that's foolish, actually. I'll give you an example. I recently interviewed the great historian Gerald Horne. And somebody responded and said, oh, well, Gerald Horne is basically a black nationalist. And I'm like, well, first of all, he doesn't call himself that. You're imputing that onto him. You're imputing that onto him. He calls himself a Marxist historian. So we do need to take people at their word, right? And Marxism will not survive in the age of the decline of the workers' movement and the absence of the international. It will not survive with such petty squabbles, in my opinion, because it doesn't have anywhere to go. It needs to be housed. So I think that maybe to Aaron's point, the answer would be not so much the theoretical soundness and novelty and interest of Marx and all of his interdisciplinary beauty. The fact that he can touch on poetry, the fact that he can touch on a theory of alienation, the focus on the totality, all of those things are fabulous intellectually. But maybe our future is to recognize that Marxism is most helpful in its practical expression, right? And there we have something to teach to the populists, because the populists ultimately don't really have the same kind of tradition. They don't. They don't look at theory the same way that we do, right? They don't look at matter and idea. That's not a problem for them, right? Our tradition has thought about every problem and rethought it every generation, to your point. And that's its great value. That's its great value. So I think we should all be happy about that fundamental intellectual egalitarianism of our tradition, and the fact that most of us are, relatively novice, but that's okay because it's a life's work.
Before we close, I just want to say one last thing. Not all forms. Populism is another quite broad umbrella, but oftentimes populist approaches respond to the need to take seriously the beliefs and ideas that people have as an actual empirical fact by condescending to them. And it's packaged as meeting people where they're at. And I'm all about meeting people where they're at, but not if it just means reifying and reinforcing and flattering whatever preconceptions, whatever prejudices they might have, no matter how reactionary. You're doing capitalism's work when you do that. I think that the aim of somebody who fashions themselves as an intellectual, a scholar, is first and foremost to be a teacher, and by that I mean to interact with people in a way that takes them seriously as thinkers, which means also to challenge them, to present your own ideas, to be open to revision. Right. I mean, in terms of my actual literal students, I learn from them all the time, right? I correct my opinion all the time based on those conversations. But interacting with people on a level as equals doesn't have to mean just like condescending and flattering whatever racist, reactionary, homophobic ideas they might have. Our aim should be that's what mass media does. That's what bourgeois politicians do. They say, well, people are racist, so I got to leave them that way and just pander to their racism. What we need to do instead is to talk to people and interact with them in a way that understands that people are capable of brilliance. People are capable of real insight. Well, I think we're seeing that now, right? People, like, you strip everything away and people are able to see what's going on. And if we believe that we're right, then why would we be afraid of that, right? The aim is to help people to realize their own potential as thinkers, as creators of knowledge. That's what we should be doing, and that's the thing that I think sometimes gets lost in like misapplications of the principle of you're supposed to meet up people where they're at, not leave them there.
I think we can go a little louder. Give another big hand to Vanessa and Daniel for this great talk tonight. All right. So one final thing before we close for the night. First of all, thank you all for coming out on this cold day. Let me grab one of these. Okay. I'll deliver these while I speak. But thank you all for joining us physically and also on stream. The final thing I want to make sure everybody knows, this great talk that was here, we did have to rent the space. So I hope everybody bought a ticket. If you did not, please do so either through the Eventbrite, or you can go up and speak with Daniel to Venmo him as well, just so we can cover the fee for renting the space. But we really appreciate you all coming out tonight. We hope to do more events like this in the future. Vanessa, where can people find your work?
VanessaWills.com. That's the easiest place to find my work. I also brought some flyers with discount codes for the book. So if you're interested in that, just come up and I'll give you one. But yeah, VanessaWills.com. I feel like I'm like selling chamois or something.
The Marxist business. It's a lucrative one, hopefully. All right. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. I think some of us will be hanging out for a bit. And yeah, thank you to the speakers.
You can still grab something to drink. The kitchen is just gross. Yeah.
Going back to the.